sorry. This research community is part of the Israeli Sociological Society, and it was established in 2018 by Dr. Gili Artar and Dr. Adi Moreno. Together with many colleagues and associates, the aim of this community is to overcome the lack of representation in the field, introduce and explore LGBTQ related topics in the context of social sciences. So first of all, I would like to remind you that we have 2 more webinars coming up in September. I will post the links shortly. In addition, this lecture is recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel. I will post the link to that one as well. Also, if you would like to subscribe to our mailing list or participate in the ongoing research group dedicated to queer mythology that meets once a month, you can contact Gili or Adi. And last but not least, December 15th will mark the 5th conference of the LGBTQ research community. And I think that Adi or Gili would like to say a few words about it.
I will just later on share the file with the call for papers. If anyone is interested in participating, you're all very welcome to submit an abstract for consideration. We'd be very, very happy to have you.
Yeah, Gili, are you sharing the?
It's going to take me a while to find it, so just a minute. I'll share it in a second. You can go on. It will be on the chat in a minute.
Okay. So another thing that I wanted to ask, the lecture will be around until around 9 p.m. Israel time. After which there will be a time for Q&A. So please, if you have any questions, write them in the chat or wait until the end of the talk. So I'll just wait for you to open the call for abstracts, and after that I will introduce Professor Hill. Okay, thank you. Okay, so now I'm very excited and honored to present our speaker. Dan Haeley is a professor of modern Russian history at the University of Oxford. He's a historian of sexualities and genders in modern Russia and the Soviet Union. His publications include Russian homophobia from Stalin to Sochi, and the first full-length history of homosexuality in Russia, homosexual desire in revolutionary Russia, the regulation of sexual and gender dissent. And this is now available in a new translation to Russian. And it's called, if any Russian speakers want to find the book, it's called Другая история, сексуальное гендерское диссидентство в эволюционной России. Thank you very much, Professor Hiלי. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Ina and Gili, for inviting me to give this talk. And I feel very honored to do that for your audience. And also, I mean, it's really exciting to talk to people outside of your own discipline. That's always a bit of a high wire act, and I expect that you'll have lots of exciting questions or reactions today. Now, I looked at the title I gave you a long time ago, and I looked at the abstract that I gave you when I sat down to write the paper this week, and I was paralyzed, basically. So I decided to come today with a revised version of a different paper approaching the concepts and methods questions, but from a slightly different angle. So in this paper, I try to reconstruct why history mattered to queer movements in the West, and what historical work can offer LGBTQ activists in the post-Soviet countries. So this talk is based on a lecture that I gave in June 2018 in Kyiv, at the invitation of the organizers of Kyiv Pride, where I presented it in Russian. I've tried to update it to reflect my transformed perspectives on Russia since the 24th of February this year. But it also reflects the world that we have lost because of the 24th of February, one where the peaceful evolution and accumulation of post-Soviet LGBTQ histories could easily build a legacy for future queer generations in the region. I hope that is still possible, but there are so many obstacles now to that project, and we can discuss them in the Q&A. So let me begin. There we are. In 1975, in Toronto's Glad Day bookshop, I discovered a small book by John Lauritsen and David Thorstad called The Early Homosexual Rights Movement. The authors wrote in their introduction that, quote, the history of the first wave of gay liberation has been almost entirely suppressed, and thanks to the efforts of Stalinism and Nazism, many traces of it have been obliterated. I was truly shocked to read this, and I would be even more shocked by the contents of the book. Nothing in my education in small-town Canada had prepared me for the news that decades before the 1969 Stonewall gay liberation moment, queer people had written, organized, and fought for their sexual and human freedom. The fact that so much thinking about our existence, our struggles, and our lives had been created by queers in Germany before and after the First World War, that so much political work had been conducted in that country and elsewhere in Europe and America, filled me with conflicting emotions, hope, wonder, and rage. And I was filled with outrage to learn that Nazi and Stalinist violence had destroyed almost all remnants of that heritage. The reason all this came as a stunning shock was simple. In the early 1970s, when I came out as a teenager, it felt like gay liberation was building a brand new world, with no help from earlier generations of queers, and no patterns, models, or ideas, except what we worked out for ourselves. The silences about homosexuality was almost total in my childhood. Remember or think about an analog paper-based information regime that suppressed access to learning about sexual orientation and gender dissent. You could put all the books about queerness into a modest sitting room, the space that Glad Day Books occupied in a downtown Toronto Victorian house. I think there's a picture of it back there. Yes. The space that Glad Day Books occupied. For my gay generation in Canada, 1969 was year zero, and we were making up a revolution in real time from scratch. Looking back now, I realize that the North American gay liberation and lesbian feminist movements were not invented from scratch, of course, and that we had a lot of cultural capital to draw upon. I was very young then, and a slightly older generation of gay activists used their experience of the New Left and anti-war movements to construct a gay lib movement. A lot of Canadian gay liberationists were actually American draft dodgers, guys who fled north to avoid being sent to Vietnam. They used the tools and skills that those movements were built on to found Canada's most influential gay liberation newspaper, The Body Politic. That newspaper's collective often mentioned Vladimir Lenin's insistence that the Bolsheviks should have a newspaper as the foundation of a viable political force. The masthead of The Body Politic cited German queer emancipationist of the 1920s, Kurt Hiller, who paraphrased Marx when he declared that the liberation of homosexuals will only be the work of homosexuals themselves. The first generation of gay liberationists in Canada applied the same skills and energy to found a broad range of university and community-based institutions to help people come out to campaign for political and social rights, and to make everyday life more livable for queers. All of that was work for the present and the future. And at the same time, the first generations of queer activists in North America and Europe began to ask questions about the past. Academic history ignored us. So much work was pursued by amateur historians and community activists. In my native Toronto, the Body Politic newspaper spawned a lesbian and gay archive. It's now called Archives, where the CH is replaced by QU, and I'm trying not to eye roll here. The Archives, based on its own records and on the growing contributions of the many organizations that came and went in community politics. Community historians, some graduate students, some literature or political science professors, some just ordinary lay people, wrote histories about famous gay and lesbian figures in the past. The lesbian and gay press carried many articles about the cultural, political, and social history of queer people, as these historians published work that our community was eager to read, even if the academic journals refused then to even consider publishing such articles. By the 1980s and 1990s, some of these amateur historians became academic historians, and in the Anglosphere, gay and lesbian history followed women's and Black and ethnic history as these new streams of scholarship entered the academic mainstream. It was not an easy transition, and it was marked by many exclusions. White, cis-male men, gay men were the first to get tenure often, for example. Access to the resources and techniques of academic history, though, proved a boon to lesbian and gay history writing. The amazing work on Gay New York by George Chauncey, or on Lesbian Buffalo, Boots of Leather, Slippers of Gold by Kennedy and Davis, taught us so much about the worlds made by queers long before Stonewall. We began to understand the extreme mutability of sexual identity and the power of heteronormativity to destroy and obscure experiments in world making. In North America, the emphasis of attention was on identity construction, on the constitution of people so hidden from history. In the German-speaking world, amateur and academic queer history concentrated on the destruction of the world's first homophile liberation movement by the Nazis and on illuminating the world of queer creativity lost in 1933. German LGBT activists, as Eric Jensen has perceptively shown, linked the history of the repression of gay men and lesbians under the Nazi regime to fascist persecution of socialists and communists. The recovery and public recognition of Germany's history of homophobic persecution drove forward political demands for the recognition of queer human rights and gave German and later European Union LGBT politics its particular potency. I think that forgotten fact of the memory of Nazi persecution spawning a visible and assertive LGBT politics in Europe explains why old Europe, so-called, expected post-socialist countries to accept LGBT rights as human rights upon accession to the EU. To refuse to do so was to backslide into the totalitarianism of the 20th century. The LGBT movement's embrace of academic history was also marked by tragic loss during the HIV/AIDS crisis. Jensen argues that in the US, activists spoke about Nazi persecution and adopted the Nazis' pink triangle to associate fascist homophobia with fascist anti-Semitism and to draw a parallel between the Holocaust and the AIDS crisis. He observes that in the 1980s and 1990s, writers and activists increasingly turned to the Holocaust as a metaphor for the contemporary AIDS epidemic and to the pink triangle as the most appropriate symbol of current suffering. For US queer activists, the pink triangle became a symbol of outrage and a promise never to forget a lost generation. Later debates over the histories of the HIV/AIDS crisis and over Nazi approaches to homosexuality and the so-called asocial lesbian showed that simplistic appropriations of the Jewish Holocaust the pink triangle or the black asocial triangle were not fully accurate as history. And yet, by the end of the 20th century, the power of history as a core tool for LGBT movements in the West was undeniable. Histories of oppression worked by addressing two audiences. By speaking inwardly to LGBT people and communities, history had the power to unite and consolidate a movement. And by speaking outwardly to the mainstream, historical lessons about the dangers of intolerance could persuade politicians and the public to grant LGBT people full citizenship. I've spoken at some length about the relationship between the Western LGBT movement and LGBT history writing, because we don't often think about how that relationship emerged and how the Western LGBT movement actively wrote its own histories. We also seldom question the relationship between LGBT activism and history writing. In this talk, I want to ask that question with reference to the post-socialist countries of the former Soviet Union. Do LGBT movements in this region need history? Is a queer history of Latvia, of Ukraine, of Georgia, Belarus, Russia, etc., so very necessary? Clearly, activists in Ukraine have more urgent tasks. One remarkable victory appears to be President Zelensky's August 2022 acceptance of the petition on same-sex marriage and partnerships in a wartime context where same-sex couples need the assurance that their relationships will be respected in life-threatening circumstances. Maybe LGBT people in the region should focus on the present, on the political issues that matter right now, and leave the history writing to a less contentious time, or to retired people perhaps. And anyway, in the digital world, the historical past is so last century. The contemporary information regime is entirely different from the one that I grew up in as a teenager coming out in Canada in 1975. Now, information is ubiquitous. Who needs a usable past, a history, when the present is so constantly visible and urgent on our smartphones and our tablet screens? Why should post-Soviet LGBT communities bother with their history? My answers to these questions are going to focus, first of all, on the critics of LGBT history writing, and I'll look at the accusations made against history with a capital H by queer theorists in the West. I also want to look at how historians answered those criticisms and how historians actually work today, or could work in post-Soviet countries, to produce local queer histories. Finally, I will conclude by making some arguments about why LGBT history matters for the post-Soviet world and why it is worth constructing a queer past. I'm going to argue that a queer past will enable a better, richer queer future, and that the post-Soviet world can use its queer past not only in local and national conversations about queer citizenship, but also on a global stage, to challenge the current domination of Western ways of thinking about the experience of LGBT people in the past. So turning to think about the trouble with history. Non-academics might be surprised to find that in the Western world, queer theorists and historians of queer sexualities often disagree with each other about the nature of history and what sort of memory work is important. This is actually an old discussion in LGBT studies, one you could trace back to the late 19th century and the earliest debates between homosexual intellectuals over the nature of gender and sexual variance and how it should be thought and written about for wider consumption. I'll focus on three recent critiques of history. Some queer theorists have asked whether the conventions of the discipline of history are too straight to accommodate the queer past. They have asked whether there is such a thing as queer time and how it differs from straight time. And they have questioned whether the archives of governments, public bodies, and private collections are reliable enough resources for the reconstruction of a usable past. Is queer memory, shaped by queers and by present-day concerns, of more value to remembering collectives than traditional history? 20 years ago, Lisa Duggan challenged LGBT scholars to relax their disciplinary boundaries and some of the methodological constraints that bolster them. Historians, she claimed, should think less rigidly about the queer past, and queer theorists, most of them scholars of literature and culture, should not be so quick to dismiss history and its possibilities. Other critics agreed. Conventional lesbian and gay historical work of the 1970s and 1980s, conforming to the rigors of the influential trend of social history and trying to document the real, had done much to recuperate and restore past lives, and in the process build communities. But the discipline's empiricism, its dependency on conventional archives, and its alleged default setting to narratives of progress were said by queer theorists to have constrained the imagination and limited our emotional connections with the past. Maybe some forms of historical reconstruction were possible, as Chauncey demonstrated for New York and Kennedy and Davis did for Buffalo. But it seemed to some critics that whole continents of queer experience were lost if we accepted the rules of academic history. A particular feature of history writing has been its tendency to Eurocentrism and to a West versus the rest perspective, one that for a long time ignored the post-colonial world, global histories, and the experience of marginalized peoples. Today, we have to admit that the history of homosexuality, as recovered by the social historians of the 1970s and 80s, was a Western narrative that usually failed to examine how colonial relationships with the rest of the world shaped our vision of queerness at home. An interesting recent example of this kind of critique comes from Heike Bauer, whose really interesting book, The Hirschfeld Archives, revisits the history of the early homosexual emancipation movement through a rigorous rereading of the work of Magnus Hirschfeld. Hirschfeld was, of course, the principal hero of Lauritsen and Thorstad's 1974 history of the early queer movement that rocked my world. A socialist Jewish victim of Nazi persecution, defender of the human rights of homosexuals and trans people, lesbians as well. Bauer offers us a corrective, showing us that Hirschfeld's scientific study and activism was implicated in German colonialism and often dependent on knowledge acquired in Germany's colonies in Africa or in anthropological comparison with other colonized peoples. She argues that his defense of homosexuality in Germany was predicated on a strategy of highlighting trauma and exploitation, sometimes at the expense of racially or sexually excluded others. Similarly, Kaji Amin's Disturbing Attachments asks whether LGBT celebration of the life and activism of Jean Genet doesn't sometimes ignore the darker side of the French writer's attachment to forms of troubling racialized and intergenerational sexual affinities. The heroes of queer history are found to have tarnished halos, and our narratives of progress are built on colonialism, racism, misogyny, and other exclusions. Critics of conventional LGBT history writing like David Halperin and Valerie Rohe also attack the professional historian's caution about anachronism. Academic historians, in seeking to understand the past in its own terms, are trained to resist reading the past through the lenses of the present. In other words, we try to stay alert for what is strange, different, unfamiliar in our documents. Trained to look for the unfamiliar and valorize it over the familiar, historians can fail to recognize sisters and brothers in the queer past. By sticking to the rules of the proper professional historian, we thereby lose opportunities to identify with strange lovers in history. As David Halperin admitted, identification with same-sex relations found in the past gets at something important. It picks out resemblances, connections, echo effects. We want to feel our common queer humanity across time, regardless of the rules of the historical game. Valerie Rohe goes even further by referring to psychoanalysis and its understanding of the evolution of the self. She reminds us that Freud sees the personality as constantly reconstructing the past and projecting falsifications on the genuine events of past life. The mind, in other words, works ahistorically. And I have a rather long quote here that I'm going to read. Because anachronism structures all psychic life, the ahistorical, like the propensity for homosexual attraction, is typical, not exceptional. Freud's understanding that the normal is pathological and the pathological is normal may be his greatest and most humane insight. Everyone fails at development. Everyone is subject to sexual perversity. Everyone falls back in time. Under these circumstances, straight hegemony must represent anachronism as deviance in order to displace the burden of the ahistorical onto others, queers, people of color, each differently stigmatized as primitive, and to claim for itself the role of truth, not falsification, the path of progress, not regression. For Rohi, we queers are all already ahistorical because of our perversity and failed development. Resisting straight time means we need to recognize and honor queer time. Queer time is a model of time that makes space for our supposed backwardness, our failure. The critics who argue for thinking queerly about time point out that straight narratives regulate temporality to belittle or slow down queer progress, as in the phrase, gay is just a phase you're going through, or commonplace wisdom like Russia or Ukraine or Georgia is not ready for full LGBT rights, but will be after a long transition period. Careful identification across time, strategic anachronism, enables us to challenge straight narratives about deviance and failure. It offers the prospect of a richer understanding of the queer predicament in a straight world. A final set of critics of conventional gay and lesbian history focus on what Duggan called the stunted archive of the queer past. In a world dominated by institutional heteronormativity, where archives are compiled and policed by the straight state, these critics ask how we could possibly fathom the experience of queer lives in the past if we only rely on the archive bequeathed to us by straight-thinking archivists and cultural gatekeepers. By sticking to convention, by respecting a politics of information curated against our interests, aren't we doomed to reproduce that homophobic perspective on our experience? As early as 1980, Robert K. Martin, commenting on how American gay biography had falsified and distorted thanks to the heteronormative forces in life writing, declared, "They've taken away our lives and we have paid for the loss." The straight archive, in other words, edits us out. Anne Cvetkovich proposes an archive of feelings. We need to recognize how trauma has structured our lives and understand how speech about trauma fails to find its way often into the straight archive. And she writes, trauma challenges common understandings of what constitutes an archive. Because trauma can be unspeakable and unrepresentable, and because it is marked by forgetting and dissociation, it often seems to leave behind no records at all. Trauma puts pressure on conventional forms of documentation, representation, and commemoration, giving rise to new genres of expression, such as testimony, and new forms of monuments, rituals, and performances that can call into being collective witnesses and publics. Successful memory work, in Cvetkovich's view, should not restrict itself to the archive compiled by the straight state. We should be creating our own archives, based as much on emotion, sentiment, and feeling as on events, politics, or hard facts, to document our experience more richly. Popular documentation, artistic reconstruction, fiction, and fantasy all have a role in Cvetkovich's vision of how to rethink queer history. So turning to think about history as a tool. Knowledge is not made for understanding, it is made for cutting. So wrote Foucault over 40 years ago. In fact, most historical research that is conducted in the Anglosphere these days does not merely help us to understand, but it also assists us to cut through long accepted ideas, to cut through prejudice and fixed positions to enable us to innovate. Contemporary historical practice is no longer merely factographic. It accepts very little as primordial, as unquestionably true as uncontestable. The alert historian combs through the archives, libraries, and interviews to accumulate evidence purposively, to analyze a question in its complexity, to trace the origins of a question, to deconstruct how a particular set of relations of power came to be. The contemporary historian strives to be self-aware, to reflect on what his subject position is, where his questions come from, why he's asking them. In today's digital public sphere, there's no respect for the historian who fails to assess their own positionality and their own preoccupations. I want to explore in this section how contemporary historical practices can assist queer movements in their activism. How can history answer the critics, and what can historical study contribute to queer politics? First, I'll discuss some of the questions that queer histories can explore and argue that doing so is important for cementing queer solidarity and building queer communities. Second, I'll answer some of the criticisms about conventional history with a few observations about the potential it offers for studying the queer past in the countries of the former Soviet Union. I began this lecture with a description of one of the major problems that queer youth often face. Most young people growing up in a straight family and a heteronormative world receive almost no information about queer life and queer possibilities. Instead, they encounter what Didier Eribon calls insult, an onslaught of homophobia, transphobia, misogyny, and incomprehension if they express their queer desires. It takes very little conditioning in a child's life to produce what Valerie Traub and others labeled gay shame, the title of an interesting collection of essays on this phenomenon. Eribon calls insult the formative experience in the making of the gay self in our modern Western world. And I would add that insult very much shapes the making of queer selves in the non-West today. Insult, shame, and trauma are recurrent structuring tools of a homophobic information regime. Few critics of queer existence have commented on it explicitly, but a highly damaging aspect of recurrent insult on queer minds is the rupture between generations of queers. We are prevented by shame, by censorship, by homophobia and violence from passing information about queerness from one age cohort to the next. We live in a world where the transmission of queer knowledge to young people is still regarded with fear, hysteria, and political hostility. In such a world, it's fundamentally important to transmit queer knowledge to young people. To know that previous generations have confronted and coped with the dilemma of the queer self is a powerful knowledge to have. To know how previous generations of queers understood themselves is enriching and inspiring. It is part of that reconstruction of the personality that Rohi pinpoints. Healing the trauma of insult begins with understanding how others have managed that dilemma. As well, finding patterns and models for living a livable LGBT life is the start of a journey to self-realization that could take a young person in endless trajectories. The fact of the existence in the world of ways of living a viable queer life should not be hidden from the young queer person embarking on their own path in life. So historical work, and perhaps particularly queer biography, can help the next queer generation to heal its traumas, address its questions about constructing viable selves, and rescue queer people from isolation and pointless ignorance. In fact, stories about queer heroes are necessary to demonstrate that queer lives are livable lives, that trauma can be overcome, and that the wheel does not have to be reinvented in every generation. Consider the online Museum of LGBT History of Russia and their statement of values. Knowledge about the history of the LGBT community makes life for both the LGBT community and wider society better. Whatever the queer theory critics say about the tools of history, these tools actually still have a lot to contribute to the building of LGBT consciousness and community. Conventional historical research is far from exhausted as a method in the former Soviet Union. there's still a wealth of opportunity to discover unknown queer stories in the conventional archives and in private collections in the former Soviet Union. Some finds are being made today are spectacular. For example, Ineta Lipsha's discovery of the dial of male homosexual Kaspars Alexandros Irba, who lived the entire span of the 20th century and who wrote from 1940 to 1996. It's an amazing Latvian source with Soviet, European, and global significance. This huge text, millions of words long, runs through a succession of political regimes, chronicling queer life in Riga, and will be of critical value for understanding queer male networks, ideas, and subjectivities in late Soviet life. Lipsha's find was a fortuitous referral from a private source, but official state archives should not be dismissed as too straight to matter. We need more queer eyes in these archives to search for, to recognize, to rescue, and to preserve the materials about LGBT lives that do exist in state collections. By queer eyes, I mean a researcher's gaze that is well informed through careful study of existing LGBT historiography, and I would say queer theory as well, about the places where queer material might surface in the official records. A gaze that appreciates the queer potentiality of seemingly straight documents and situations. And a gaze, of course, that reads queer materials empathetically, without homophobia or a presumption of primordial traditional values. My call for more queer eyes in the archives grows from my experience in Russian archival collections and encounters with ill-informed, unempathetic historians there attempting to read queer documents, of which there are many. In the ex-Soviet republics, the straight states' archives of queer experience are not so much stunted archives as simply denied or ignored by professionals. When queer documents have emerged from the Soviet archives since 1991, they have often been misread or handled crudely by homophobic historians and archivists. And queer eyes are needed, like the Belarusian Vladimir Volodzin's and the Russian Ira Roldugin's queer eyes, to reread and reinterpret the historiography and primary material that exists in the state archives. There's still plenty of conventional historical investigation to do, in other words, and not only in Russia, but in the other republics of the former Soviet Union. Now, that doesn't mean that LGBT activists and artists in the former Soviet Union have decided that popular documentation, artistic reconstruction, and fantasy, the ahistorical tools imagined by Cvetkovic, Halperin, Rohi, and Duggan, among others, are too Western or irrelevant to use in the region for constructing local forms of what is called insurgent commemoration. I borrowed that term from AIDS historiography. In the time I have remaining, I'd like to describe recent activist and artist historical political projects that might make academic historians uncomfortable. Some of these blend activism and journalism, or campaigning and artistic license, to produce what are readable in conventional terms as LGBT histories. Others go much further, engaging the emotions and intellect through fiction and drama to expand and extend the field of queer experience beyond the realm of hard facts, to give substance to queer feeling, trauma, and loss. To start with more conventional activist appropriations of history, the Belarusian LGBT Makeout Collective, which functioned from 2013 to 2022, it signed off in January of this year, relied on familiar techniques of journalism, storytelling, and historical commemoration to bring queers together and to communicate with the wider world. Makeout.by ran a web portal for news, events, and history. In the face of state violence and severe repression, they ceased operations, but their site effectively archives the work of the LGBTQ communities of Belarus since the early 2000s and even earlier, and it's a fascinating resource. In 2017, the collective published the Makeout album with hard copy examples deposited in European university libraries and LGBTQ archives. The album brings together historical and contemporary essays, photography, and artistic work in a contemporary design that is attractive and exciting. It is intended to leave a physical trace of the many activities of the current generation of LGBTQ activists in Minsk and Belarus. Makeout represents the fourth generation of Belarusian LGBT community activity since independence. Burnout and political repression have come in cycles that have silenced previous generations, and state violence has curbed the Makeout generation from activism within the country now. So leaving this physical trace, this object, in the form of an album that future readers and researchers will find in catalogs, online, and on library shelves, is an important gesture of solidarity with the future and a prophylactic against loss that was already foreseen 4 years before Belarus's recent political crisis. More methodologically unconventional are two projects that push the boundaries of historical fact to engage the emotions and the intellect. NSFW, The Chairman's Tale, was an art project created by Jānis Sama in 2015 in Estonia and exhibited in Venice in 2015 at the Biennale and then Tallinn in 2016. It is a sophisticated example of the kind of memory work that is possible when queer theory and historical discipline collaborate. The project, a synthesis of documentary fact and queer imagination, reveals the most obscure corners of Soviet queer life. Sama began by interviewing aging Estonian gay men, and he heard stories about the chairman, a pivotal figure in the late Soviet Tallinn queer world. Using his queer eyes, Sama recovered trial records and the chairman's police file in the state archives. The artist rejects the idea that the official record of the chairman's, his name was Juhan Oaste, of his case is nothing but a stunted archive, unworthy of our attention. Rather, he's elevated this material to a focal objet d'art upon which our gaze must be directed. Contrary to theoretical dismissals, this police file is not a stunted archive, but a rich and textured, meaningful source, a launch point for contemplation, reflection, and creative reconstruction. In addition to archive-based storytelling, Sama composed an operatic aria about the chairman's tragic life and shot a series of videos reimagining his sex life in the toilets of Tallinn. He also combed the photographic archives of Soviet Estonia's collective farms. The hero, Orasta, was a collective farm chairman, for homoerotically charged images. The result is a powerful example of how insurgent commemoration brings conventional historical research and creative imagination together, synthesizing emotion and memory of trauma. Finally, an entirely fictional queer history from Georgy Mamedov and Oksana Shatalova of the Shtab Art Project in Bishkek in Kyrgyzstan was created in 2015 for a contemporary art festival in Brisbane, Australia. The Queer in Space Kollontai Commune Archive uses the conventions of documentary film for insurgent purposes. The project offers a commentary on the lost tradition of sexual freedom of the early Soviet Revolution by manufacturing a Soviet 1970s commune of dissidents who supposedly tried to recreate a Marxist sexual revolution in Soviet Kyrgyzstan. A short documentary describes the discovery of an archive of the so-called Kollontai commune of queer dissidents who critiqued the late Soviet gender order from Marxist principles. Experts from the School of Theory and Action Bishkek, or Shtab, in fact, the artists and their collaborators, quote from the confected documents in the archive, display poetry and a poster to reveal the fictional communes Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Kollontai-inspired critique of conventional family relations. The expert interviews are interspersed with poetry readings based on the supposed archive of the Kollontai commune. Mamedov and Shatalova were inspired by the story of the Leningrad Gay Laboratoria, a real group of queer dissidents that formed in 1983, and the KGB broke it up in 1984, not surprisingly. Mamedov and Shatalova blogged their critical appreciation of gay laboratoria's work, but also challenged the unexamined Russocentrism of the gay laboratoria activists in Leningrad. Mamedov and Shatalova's fictional queer commune, set in 1970s Soviet Kyrgyzstan, challenges the metropolitan bias of the Leningrad gay laboratoria group and reimagines a queer left politics in utopian decolonized form. The Kyrgyz LGBTQ Artist Project demonstrates that historical narrative need not be tethered to historical fact to argue for queer ideas and futures. Here, the loss is of Marxism's extended queered potential, the utopian potential it might have pursued to challenge hierarchies of gender, nation, and sexual normativity. Such critiques of Stalinist and post-Stalinist Soviet Marxism from the left have long been part of the gay, lesbian, feminist, and queer assessment of the socialist experiment in the West. But few activists have reached for artistic fiction to reposition their utopias in Central Asia, and the boldness of the Bishkek project shows how history, reimagined, can decenter our perspectives. Some concluding thoughts. I've argued that history has a lot to contribute to the struggle for LGBT citizenship in the post-Soviet world. Whatever the queer theory critics say about the dangers of relying on conventional history to write the queer past, and some of the dangers are real, I still believe that our history matters. It matters more than ever in a world where the information regime about homosexuality and queer genders is changing as rapidly as the technologies that filter, select, and deliver information to our phones and screens. We live in the Google information age, the Google information regime. When I was a teenager coming to terms with my homosexuality in 1975 in Canada, a heteronormative information regime was beginning to crumble, but the ways of providing information continued to reflect the straight politics of libraries, archives, and electronic media. Representations of queer lives barely existed then in the public sphere. Today's information regime is incredibly fragmented now. As queer sociologist Emma Edenborg has recently argued, it's not accessibility of information that matters so much anymore as how it is framed and presented to us. Knowing where we came from, what kinds of challenges we faced, and how we overcame them is more urgent than ever. And giving these stories the attention they deserve depends on our willingness to make them exciting and to communicate them to the wider world, and especially future generations of LGBT citizens. LGBTQ activism in the former Soviet Union shows us the viability of doing LGBTQ history in the region. Post-Soviet queers have already decided that yes, they do need a history, and they have not neglected producing histories because of more pressing political priorities. The geopolitics of LGBT struggles and homophobic campaigns in the region make queer history more relevant, not less so. History written using the power of the creative imagination and the power of queer eyes in the archives can harness and inspire the emotions, confirm and heal queer trauma, and recover loss inflicted by years of homophobia. Activist insurgent commemoration and creative historical art projects are a critical phenomenon in the LGBT politics of the region, helping to challenge traditional values agendas of local politicians. Yet at the same time, they also offer a message for queer Western activists and theorists, giving us the chance to diversify and decenter queer theory and challenge Western epistemologies of knowledge making. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was a compelling lecture. I want to open the floor for questions. If anyone wishes to, try to, no. Okay, if no one, I wanted person to ask you a question. about the concept, like the concept of, you said about, you talked about a bit about the queer time and straight time, and like heteronormative time. So, and from what I read in Russia, like in the Soviet Union, there was also like before, like between 1917 and the rise of Stalin, there was like a surge of acceptance for homosexuals and sexuality in general, and then like it went backwards. So I just wanted to say, how does that relate to the concept of queer time and queer history? Because like in the West, the West shows progress, but the Soviet Union it's not a straight line, if you know what I'm saying, if you understand.
Well, in the era of Trump, it's hard to speak about a straight line of progress in the West. But we have to be hopeful, right? I think what is interesting about that interval between the Russian Revolution, or what I have started to call the revolution of the Russian Empire and its subject peoples, and the rise of Stalin and the recriminalization of homosexuality in 1933-34, is that we're learning more about what ordinary people actually thought about the sexual revolution. But we still have not got very good grassroots histories of what the sexual revolution looked like, what people thought, how they exchanged ideas around this, and so on. There are some decent studies of the sexual theme in literature. There are some decent studies of debates in the Soviet press, but we have much less of that fine-grained sort of personal discussion of what people wrote in their diaries about sexuality. For example, I know Igor Halfin has done some work on communist consciousness, and he refers to sexology and sexologists among some of the communists he examines. And that's like just scratching the surface, really. We really don't know an awful lot about what communists did or said, or indeed just ordinary Soviet citizens more generally, about their sexual lives in the 1920s, in this period of so-called sexual revolution that was Kollontai influenced, that was influenced by these more utopian ideas that the Shtab collective in Bishkek was celebrating and recuperating in their fictional project. But it would be a really important historical project, I think, for someone to sort of take this kind of subjective turn and look at diaries and so on that might allow us to capture more of this. Ira Roldugina's work on homosexual voices is really important. She has found caches of letters that mostly gay men, some lesbians, wrote to psychiatrists and famous physicians in the 1920s to explain their homosexuality to the experts, as it were, and to, in a sense, have an argument with them about pathologization and about the meaning of the sexual revolution. So there are important entry points. Someone needs to just tie together some of this work in this package into something that is more consolidated around mentalities in the sexual revolution, or subjectivities in the sexual revolution, to sort of figure out what was actually going on the ground in people's minds. But that's not actually an answer to your question about temporalities, but it's my riff on what we still need to do in order to have an understanding of that temporality. Because I think the historical research is still thin there.
Yeah, so thank you very much. Are there other questions? For some reason I can't see.
I try to raise my hand, but I'll just speak up if it's okay with you. I actually have two questions. First of all, it was really fascinating, and thank you. I want to ask one question which is not very queer, and I apologize for that. But you were talking about the importance of history as a tool, and you were very persuasive in that respect. But I'm wondering, where do you draw the line, if indeed we want to draw the line, between history and fiction? And what does it mean to use history as a tool when creating a fiction narrative, actually? And how do you see that? And another question, which may be more pragmatic, but you talked a lot about the importance of archives. And one of the things that we see with archives in Israel is that the government tends to burn them to the ground or just hide them. I'm wondering if there is any thought or discussion about how to protect archives in the time of war and in the time of homophobia, which are two kinds of state-run violence that really also happen to affect archives, among other things. So those were my questions for now.
They're wonderful questions and super, super hard to answer, especially this first one about the ethics of fiction and history. I think those are questions that I would struggle with, to be honest with you. I came to learn about these artistic projects in the former Soviet Union. First of all, with what's left of my hair standing on end as a historian. I was the conventional historian, you know, from a decent history department, sort of going, oh, my God, they're making things up. You know, people will look on the internet and think there actually was a Kollontai commune in Bishkek. This is horrible. It has taken me some time to come around to the understanding that where either the archives are lacking because the government burns them or doesn't let you into them, or where what one wants to say isn't backed up by a paper trail, or what the world one wants to imagine isn't backed up by a paper trail, then other techniques might apply. And we already have a pretty solidly established genre of historical fiction that operates in Russian, it operates in English, it operates in virtually every literary language. There we see examples of good practice and bad practice that should offer us guidance, I think, when thinking about the ethics of creation and collaboration. I mean, scholars who only work with hard facts and paper trails might wish to work with artists who are going to extrapolate and imagine. And I can fully imagine myself doing that now in a way that I couldn't even 5-6 years ago when I started thinking about these issues and encountering these projects. So I think it's that thing of conventional historians needing to let their hair down and understand what the advantages of doing this would be. And also at the same time reflecting very seriously on what the ethics and limits of such practices would be, because you're quite right, we could end up in fantasy worlds where the Civil War was in the United States was won by the wrong side, and so on and so on. That's maybe not where we need to go, but I think that there are models out there that could guide historians who would be tempted to work with artists in this kind of collaboration, for example. I mean, I was very struck in the Not Safe for Work project, Janis Sama's project in Estonia, how the launch pad was the paper trail. The launch pad was the story about the chairman as it was written in the state archive, but then it became possible to imagine so much more. And on reflection, I realized that, well, in fact, that's often what the historical novelist does. They imagine parts of reality that never get documented. What goes on in a person's head when they're when they're a victim of the Holocaust, or what goes on in a person's head when they are a servant in the court of Henry VIII. Those kinds of exercises in imagination are permitted, aren't they? They're accepted in our culture, and we know that there are limits to taste, acceptability, to what we would want to read in those, and that's not a guarantee that bad stuff won't happen in the use of this method. But it's at least some guardrails that could help us to answer that question. But I think it's a live and never-ending question, actually, how you would draw those lines. And it has to be, I think, in every instance, decided upon by the individual historian and the artist, who must take responsibility for their work, of course. What do you do when archives are being destroyed or made inaccessible or otherwise blocked? Some of my Russian colleagues have taken to the practice of throwing just about everything they have encountered in the archives online as PDFs, putting it into Telegraph channels, creating blogs where they distribute the work freely. I mean, after all, this is, in a sense, national property, and the nation deserves to see it. So there is an argument there that sending it to the Creative Commons is the right response when you find something, and that sitting on it the way the conventional historian would sit on it, as, oh, this is my, my special archive, my treasure that I am going to dole out in small pieces, which I myself have been guilty of in my time. It's not actually what should be happening in queer history, perhaps. And it's important too, I think, to send copies of whatever documents one locates to LGBTQ archives to ensure that they get preserved in more than one place, essentially, and that collections of those documents become available to future researchers, not just in the usual locations of the state archive, but in places where people with more empathy are likely to hang on to them. It's not a perfect answer, because war will destroy archives, as we are seeing now in Ukraine, and political regimes will find ways to obstruct and block and so forth. I have to say, when I was working in the ex-Soviet archives around queer issues for the 30 years between, say, 1990 and 2020, I was only ever denied one document that had to do with queer issues, and that was the autobiography of a lesbian who had been imprisoned in the Gulag. And it was denied to me on the grounds that it was a personal document, personal details there. 75 years had not passed, and so therefore it was not to be distributed. But thank you for these questions. They're really good.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question? I would like to add my gratitude for the very inspiring lecture and for learning a lot from. And I wanted to, if you can sharpen the point that you think you referred twice, but you didn't elaborate on, about the importance of recovering the past of the former Soviet Union queer life, mentioning that it can kind of challenge the Western hegemony and kind of maybe lead to something more, it fits more the local construction of queer life. Can you elaborate on this? I think it's very relevant here in the Middle East, that many people, the Arab people, that have their own rich queer life history, but now in the polarization of the West and the West, conceptualize queer as something Western. And is there any kind of a way out of this paradox that when queer people are oppressed everywhere in the world, usually they get support from the West and they get some models and financial support and cultural models to out. Is it bad, or is there a way out? What did you refer when, or what did you have in mind when you mentioned this issue?
It's a good one. I wish I had a magic wand that would solve this problem, but it's a live problem, isn't it? I mean, when we approach describing queer experience in the present as well as queer experience in the past beyond the standard West, we run into the danger of being accused of Western centrism and failing to decolonize our perspectives and failing to listen to local voices. And I think that is the main route out of this paradox, is actually to look for and listen for local voices in the story. You shouldn't be asking for a professor from Oxford to come and talk to you about this, in other words. Yeah, you should be asking for scholars from the region, or who originated in the region and who've perhaps gone back to the region and done field work of some kind or other, and who can deliver something that is more grounded, more rooted in that region. I think that would be best practice. So I'm thinking of recent collections collections of essays that try to do this in some way or other. There's one I'm looking at on the floor here called Decolonizing Queer Experience, edited by Emily Channel Justice. And it includes essays by various people from the region talking about historical and anthropological and sociological studies, small-scale studies of queer past and queer presence in places like Armenia, in Latvia, in Ukraine, and so on. And they are attending to local voices in a serious way. And while in some respects that collection doesn't always successfully synthesize what it's done, I think what its main accomplishment is actually having brought those voices to the table and to the notice of queer studies people who care about this region, I think. And so just to give you a couple of examples, I think there is an essay about queer activism in Armenia, which is obviously not an easy place to do queer activism in, but it is simpler than it might be, say, in Kazakhstan, for example, by Tamar Shirinyan, called Queering Identity Misrecognition as a Performative Refusal in Armenian LGBT Advocacy. And what she really talks about there is the struggle that local activists have in digesting global terminology and categories and funders, priorities and criteria, and making that somehow effective and recognizable and readable in the Armenian context. I found that essay really, really helpful in just thinking about that sort of sausage making process of taking something from the global West and trying to deploy it, or deciding that doesn't work, it's staying out in that local context. And I thought that was, for example, a really useful essay in terms of thinking about what is probably more likely going on the ground than something that a Western historian from, say, the University of Michigan could tell us, lovely as those people are. So I think that if there is any kind of serious solution to this, it's actually about attending to the voices of people in those regions. And those voices, you can say, have already been polluted by global LGBT terminology and categories and ideology and values. And I'm afraid that's where we are. That's the world we live in. And those people have put their lives on the line to recognize some aspect of those categories in very difficult circumstances. They, I think, deserve our respect and our ears to figure out what it is that we can learn from them and what it is we can do possibly to help them. And that might be sometimes shutting up rather than saying something.
Can you show us the cover of the book?
Oh, yes, of course. Is that visible?
Yeah, yes.
Yeah.
I don't know if you know the work about the Islamic world, the Arab world, and Joseph Massad book. I think it's a lot of parallels between the situations and the challenges.
I think some of this has, I've reflected on this a little bit in my book on Russian homophobia. There's sort of the fact of Russia's being in Europe and not being in Europe at the same time. And I think something like that holds for the Middle East as well, doesn't it? There is a proximity to Europe and a resemblance to European forms of ways of life and modernity, or whatever you want to call it, and a difference as well. And it's trying to understand those that complexity and contextualize the LGBT experience, complexity of being in Europe and not in Europe. I think that's the puzzle I've struggled with in my own work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. Firstly, again, thank you very much, and also apologies, but I'll run out as soon as you answer my question. I wanted to ask you about the challenges of writing queer histories in the era of identity politics, and in the era in which a lot of what we write, what we do, what we say is constantly under scrutiny, not only from the outside world, but also from inside the queer communities and other political communities that we're affiliated with. And how is this challenge met, negated, and dealt with in post-Soviet countries? Or is it even relevant to them, to their politics?
This is another tough question, isn't it? It's a real dilemma, I think, for scholars working on the region. I mean, I just alluded to it in that essay by Shirinyan about the download of global LGBTQ identities to a place like Armenia and their eventual digestion into local LGBT politics. That's, you know, just one example of that kind of problem of the troubles with identity. I did some field work in Ukraine around the time I went for the Kyiv Pride, and also before that, talking to activists involved in different community organizations in Kyiv alone. And I was very struck then, this is before, of course, the 2022 invasion, very struck then by the raging disagreements within the community about things like the value of Kyiv Pride. Should there even be a Pride March? What was this actually accomplishing politically and socially for LGBTQ communities? There were also very strong disagreements, which I suspect have been muted now, around the degree of militarization in Ukrainian society that was going on, and the masculinism attached to that. So from a feminist or a lesbian perspective, some voices were saying that the LGBTQ community is getting too closely attached to ideas of the nation, ideas of the martial nation, ideas of all the things I'm sure that are familiar to an Israeli audience thinking about LGBT politics in the region. So homo-nationalism, big bad homo-nationalism. So those issues, I've encountered this in several conferences in the last 4 or 5 years before COVID on LGBT studies in the region, just that the internal disagreements are almost as fierce as the external ones, and they're mostly around those kinds of issues, with some very fierce queer committed critiques of standardized, globalized LGBT identities, cookie cutter identities, and cookie cutter politics, basically. I think Pride has been a particular flashpoint, and obviously not just in Ukraine, but in other countries as well. I had some photographs there from Baltic Pride from 2018, where there was obviously some disagreement still in the LGBT community in Latvia about the value of pride as such. But it seems to have become part of the formula for how you demonstrate your Europeanness and how you perform your democratic credentials. And it is very interesting, for example, that Zelensky didn't simply bat away this petition that he received at the beginning of August, asking for the Ukrainian state to recognize same-sex marriage, but gave an answer that opened the door to civil partnerships, if not marriage. Marriage is legally impossible because of the nature of the Constitution, and the Constitution can't be changed in wartime. Was the explanation that he gave, but he also said that the measure of a democratic state is how it respects the rights of all its citizens. And so he didn't close the door on that. I would say, I guess, that those disputes and debates are every bit as live in those communities, but they can feel quite rarefied in those political circumstances, and not always the most important debates to be pursuing, or the most important forms of scholarship to be pursuing. If I could be as bold as to say, we probably need, less work on the sort of minutiae of queer critiques of Kyiv Pride, and maybe more sort of fieldwork studies on what it is that the Ukrainian elite thinks it's doing by mobilizing LGBT politics. That would be really interesting to know. So, I mean, there's a chapter in the Channel Justice book about just exactly this kind of anti-identity politics, or worrying as well about gay male identities coming too close to a form of homonationalism in the Ukrainian context, and that's even before 2022. And it seemed to me to be using a sledgehammer to crack a nut, and that it would be more valuable to know something about the wider society's attitudes towards homosexuality, and particularly politicians and Europeanizing politicians, because they're the ones who are mobilizing this discourse and, in a sense, disciplining society to perform these discourses. But thank you for the question. I think it's a real standout problem in the region because of the partially because of the sort of global download perception, but also because of the nativist politics that's so strong in many of these countries.
Thank you. That was very interesting.
Okay, so this is the time we have for today, and I want to thank again Professor Haeley for his amazing lecture and for his time, obviously. So I wish you all good night, and I hope to see you in our next webinar, which will be on September 8th. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Can I ask then, can I ask a question, information question?